We're here to talk about Ansible for network automation. We're going to give you an introduction to what Ansible is, and then we're going to talk about why it's such a powerful tool for network engineers and operators. So, as I mentioned, we have several sections here. We have our introduction, and we're going to talk about Ansible. And we're going to talk about our next steps. And then, as previously mentioned by Jack, we're going to do a session to give you a chance to ask us questions and give you some answers. So what is automation? Automation, if you look at the slide here, says that it happens when one person meets a problem they never want to solve again. Really, automation happens when human beings, by their very nature, are lazy. That's one of our most powerful tools. In being lazy, we come up with better solutions to problems. If you're a systems administrator or a network administrator or a content manager or any of those things, whenever you accomplish a task, if you think about it, do you really ever want to do the exact same thing again? There's really no reason to. You've already figured it out. You've already used all your brain power to come up with the best solution. So the best thing to do with that is to automate the solution so you don't have to do it all again. Tons of teams are automating. You can see that in this diagram here. And really, it's every team. As I mentioned, everyone automates all the time. And really what you have to do in this business is, if you're not creating a central automation framework and you don't have a plan for your enterprise automation solution, your teams are going to do it without you. And that's what you see here. So you can see automation's happening within all these groups, whether you know about it or not. So what we have to do as enterprise network managers is to get out front and create our solution, our plan, and then invite everyone to join in and use the tools that we provided. So automation is most powerful when everyone works together. Everyone probably knows that. It's somewhat obvious. If you think about it, if you create an automated solution but no one else knows about it, only you gain any value from it. So it doesn't really help anyone else at all. So we use automation as a tool to bring everyone together and use it as a tool of collaboration. And if everyone contributes to that automation, everything will work together and everyone will understand what needs to be done, when it needs to be done, and how it gets done. That also means that we don't have any single points of failure, which is a really critical issue in our networks and in just about anything we do. So why Ansible? The biggest thing is there's a bunch of reasons here. The biggest one, I guess, is simplicity. So Ansible is not a computer programming language. That's a very big difference between it and some of the other enterprise network automation packages. Ansible doesn't require any programming language. It's all written in English language. It's also strongly formatting specified, as in it has one specific way that it wants to see the code written as far as description. You'll see an example of that in a minute. And that helps the code to be completely reusable. And again, I said code, but again, it's not a programming language. Also, Ansible on the far right, as you can see, it's agentless. That means, especially on government networks, we don't have to get approval to modify a system in order to manage it from Ansible. If you think about it, with most network automation tools, you have to put some kind of an agent out there to manage your tool set, which means you either have to deploy a host as the management agent, or if you're managing systems or devices where you can install software, you have to add a piece of software to them, which means that it may affect your existing ATO or authority to operate. It's a fairly big thing in Ansible. You don't have to do that. Also, Ansible mostly manages via SSH, which allows us to manage a ton of devices out of the box. But also, we can manage any device, whether it's SSH manageable or not. We can deal with legacy serial devices. You know, there are a lot of GPS devices that are out there and routers that don't have the ability to manage SSH, especially if their devices have been in production for years. We can manage those just fine. We can manage just about anything you can think of. We can manage printers. We can manage routers and switches. We can manage servers, anything. One of the biggest things that has brought Ansible to the forefront of network automation so quickly is the fact that Ansible is able to manage network devices across all the vendors. So this is something, if you think about it, there really haven't been too many tools out there that were able to manage everything from every vendor. That's a fairly big thing if you're a network manager, because if you have Cisco devices, you need to have Cisco's management tool. If you have Aruba devices, you need to have Aruba's management tool, you know, Arista, et cetera, whoever. You need to have all those tools, and they don't usually play very nicely together. So one of the interesting things you'll see is that Ansible was only created back in 2014. It was created by members of the Python core, the Puppet core team, which of course is not, that's written in Ruby. Ansible's written in Python, but it was created by members of the Puppet core team who thought Puppet was an incredibly powerful tool but it was too difficult for people to learn Ruby to be able to do automation in it. So they just made a tool that was based on English language instead of computer code. So, and because of that, that tool was very rapidly picked up by people doing automation, and the network vendors themselves started using it. So because of the fact that we now have that cross-platform tool, the network vendors themselves realized that this is a tool to let people get started with their devices much more quickly than they would have to do if they had to install either a vendor-specific tool or learn a new tool if they're switching from one network vendor to another. So it's a really big deal. That's one of the reasons why it has grown so quickly. As you can see on the slide, there's a ton of things you can do using Ansible, but really it comes down to you can automate anything you can think of. For example, I spent a good piece of last night automating the deployment of a browser proxy tool. And I looked at the tool. It was a really powerful new tool. It comes from the open source community, but there wasn't any real easy way to get it out on the host. So I created some automation to pull it down, push it to all my systems, go to my my switch, enable the ports to be open through the switch by adjusting the firewall, and configuring everything on the fly. And it was very quickly done. So it really gives you an idea of why this is so easy and so quick to get started with. And again, you can see on the bottom, there's a ton of devices we can manage, but really it's any device you can think of that we can manage with Ansible. So there's a ton of technologies that Ansible has built in what are called modules for, and this is a list of some of them. You can see a ton of the network vendors here. We can deal with Windows devices, virtualization, cloud, various operating systems, storage devices, monitoring management, and DevOps. There's tons of things you can do here. And again, this is growing extremely quickly. If you don't see the tool here, you'll notice it does say and more, but also you can very quickly create your own automation and management package. If there's an amazing new network device that comes on the market next week and no one has used it with Ansible before, it's extremely easy to get started and create your own modules for it. So here's some common use cases. So you can see, scheduling backups of network configuration. So if you make a change to your network flow and something doesn't work, it's very easy to fall back to the previous config. And again, most network devices have that capability built in for themselves. But if you think about it, once you deal with your entire enterprise, which again contains multiple vendor solutions in all likelihood, it's much more difficult to coordinate that. So configuration compliance. Ansible can also do checking of your configuration, and you can run it in a check mode where all it does is go look at your running configuration and tell you where it differs from your baseline. So that's a fairly big thing in a government environment. And then dynamic documentation. So Ansible, because it is written in English language, it itself is documentation. That's an incredibly powerful use case for it. In fact, I myself, I have a background working with the military and the intelligence community. I was able to take our deployment documentation, which in the past was written on paper, convert it to Ansible, and it was accepted by our security officer that the Ansible documentation was a guarantee that the configuration would never differ in deployment from what it was in theory. That's a very big thing, and it helped us to really specify getting our ATOs and speed that up. So this is how Ansible Network Automation works. So you have local execution. On whatever control node you designate, you run your code. And that Ansible playbook is what that code is. And then it contacts all the remote nodes and does whatever task it needs to do. And those actions are fully verified. So anytime that an action fails, Ansible will stop on the spot and refuse to go any further. This also helps Ansible to be what we call idempotent, which means that you can run the same playbook as many times as you want, and you're not going to end up with a weird situation of partial implementation of configuration. That's a fairly big deal if you think about it compared to the scripts. If you think about it, a lot of folks, when they're doing network automation, what they'll do is they'll take the series of commands against NOxOS or whatever device you're using, or router OS, whatever you're using, and they'll just have a text document containing all those commands, and they'll just paste it against a new switch or a new router whenever it comes online. That's great, except for the fact that if any one of those steps errors, all the other steps are still going to be run, and who knows what weird configuration situation you're going to get into. When the execution happens, what Ansible does is it takes and creates an on-the-fly execution plan on the device, and then on the device it executes everything. That's how it works with servers. Again, with switches, it does depend. Most modern switches use APIs for management. And Ansible is fully capable of using those APIs from your control node directly. So Ansible is the universal language of automation. What that really means is the same thing I've been saying. It means that you can use Ansible for any use case that you can think of. That's really its greatest power. That and the fact that when you get started with Ansible, you can get started extremely quickly. When I was first introduced to Ansible back in 2015, one of my coworkers told me how amazing it was. And it admittedly checked a box with me because being a big fan of science fiction, Ansible I knew as a reference to faster than light communication. I said, oh, that's a neat name. Let me look into this. And I started looking into it, and there was all this capability, even all the way back then. I was like, well, it's probably going to be complicated to learn, but it really wasn't. I was able to write my first Ansible playbook within an hour of starting to read about it. That really shows something. So it's very powerful, very easy to get started with. So you can see Ansible is capable across all of your different silos within your enterprise. And this goes for government enterprises as well as it does with private enterprise. So you can do development with it, you can do management, you can do automation, you can do packaging, you can do network management, anything you can think of, you can do. One of the more interesting use cases we have is that we at Red Hat do a whole series of what we call workshops. And those workshops serve as a quick introduction to all the products in the Red Hat portfolio, and they help partners of Red Hat to get started quickly with all of our solutions. We use Ansible to deploy those workshop environments and to deploy the student guides that the students use to work through the workshops in an interactive fashion. So because we do that with Ansible, it's very easy to deal with when there are issues, or during a workshop if we need to make a change, or if we determine something has happened in the cloud infrastructure we deployed against, which it's the cloud. We don't have full control over the environment. So that sort of thing is to be expected. So one of the big advantages of automation in general is the fact that when you have a problem, when there's a disaster, when you get that call at 3 o'clock in the morning on Sunday morning, your brain's going to be in a fog. You're going to be under pressure. You may have pressure from upper management. Ansible lets you bring the network back online to get it back into a known good state. And you don't have to worry about the fact that you're tired, you're stressed, etc. You will get to the state that you designated ahead of time. That is the recovery state. So you can see here, this is how Ansible's automation flows. In the center of the document here, we have our configuration management database. That could be Git, that could be Subversion, that could be whatever internal configuration management database you use. Could also be literally local. It could be local text files that are checked in somewhere. You can see that Ansible uses that to store all of its information. And from that, it pulls an inventory. Inventory is a list of all your devices being managed. That's network devices, that's servers, that's anything you can think of. The modules I already mentioned. Modules are all the tools used to take actions against devices. For example, you might have a module called network interface, for example, and that will manage network interfaces on a switch. Ansible has a fully featured command line interface that you can use, and it is pluggable, so it is very easily extendable. A lot of the extensions done in Python, but really you can do add-ons in any language you want. And again, Ansible playbooks are the tools that actually execute the automation. That's what we call the list of tasks to execute. And of course, playbook is a reference to football. And you can see Ansible managed hosts. When we say hosts, of course, we mean any device. It's network devices, it's servers, it's switches, it's printers. I keep using those examples, but really it's anything you can think of. Playbooks are written in YAML. I mentioned earlier that Ansible is English language, and that's what YAML is. YAML is formatted English language text. But basically what that means is that we force things like proper indent. One of the big difficulties with dealing with any sort of automation is the fact that you can create an incredibly powerful automation framework, but who knows what the folks who come after you or are working while you're on vacation are going to make of it. They're not necessarily going to understand it. And what are they going to do as soon as they don't understand? They're going to stop using it. So that means that all the work you did will go right out the window if the next person who comes along can't understand what you did, because nobody runs code that they don't understand, right? Especially not by copying off the internet and running code they don't understand, right? So this is a quick example. You can see this is against iOS. You can see that strong forcing of indentation there. So you see a hyphen starts a session. section, excuse me. And then we can use names. These are completely free form. You can name a step, whatever you want to do. Here we're configuring an interface. So you're going to use the module here called iOS_interfaces. So you can see right there. And then we're going to set a configuration with that module. These are the arguments for that module. So first of all, we're going to name the interface we want to manage. We're going to manage the first gigabit Ethernet block interface number 2, and we're going to turn it on. That's actually really straightforward. So you can see when I say this is English, that's what I mean. You can see this does not look like a program language. That's what it is. All it is a description of what to do. So Ansible is a descriptive language. Here's an example of an inventory. This is a text-based inventory, and I'll tell you how you can do much better than this in just a minute, but this is a very simple example. So you can see here, we have a whole bunch of devices here. You have some servers here, you have some switches, a firewall, and a load balancer. In these brackets, that's a group. So if I refer to web in anything that I execute, that will run against all of these hosts. If I refer to DB, this host, switches, these hosts, firewalls, and load balancers, these hosts. Or I can also refer to an individual host specifically. There's also a couple built-in groups, and I bet you can guess what the group all does, right? That will, of course, manage all these devices all at once. So I already mentioned we can automate anything we can think of. This is a simple playbook. And actually, before I go into that, I'm going to go back and go to the point that I was about to make about automation here. So instead of this sort of a group, it's actually much more powerful to use as an inventory sources that you already have. In your network, you might be running Microsoft Active Directory. If so, Microsoft Active Directory is an excellent inventory. Ansible has built in the ability to query Active Directory and get a list of all your devices out of it. You might be running LDAP as your central directory management, or Kerberos, or even DNS. The domain name system is a great source of inventory for Ansible. So all those things are viable. So going back to playbooks. So Ansible playbooks, because this is YAML, all playbooks start with 3 hyphens, and they ought to end with 3 dots, so that's usually not enforced. Again, all sections start with a hyphen. We're naming our playbook. It's called deploy VLANs. It's running against those hosts, again, Cisco. If you go back to our inventory list, oh, it's not a good reference, but again, we're talking about these switches here. And then we're going to do that and gather facts. Gathering facts is what Ansible calls its management of metadata. So by default, when you execute a playbook, Ansible will collect data about everything you log into. And that means even after the playbook runs, you have data on the fact that, you know, how many ports are active on your switch. You're going to know what firmware level the switch is, what its utilization is, what IP addresses are attached to it. Ansible collects tons of data. And you can, of course, define your own data you want to collect as well. Okay, and then here's the meat of what we're going to do. Again, our tasks. These are the things that Ansible is going to do. So we're going to create some VLANs. So we're going to use, and this is of course NXOS, and we're going to create VLAN ID 100. We're going to up the interface and we're going to give it a name of web, and that's our web VLAN. So the interesting thing about this again is the first time this runs, this VLAN will be created. The second time it runs, nothing will happen because the VLAN already exists. So it's a really powerful thing. So scaling. One of the most powerful things about Ansible is the fact that you can scale both horizontally and vertically with it. That means if you have a single large Ansible management host, even though that might not be the most reliable solution, you can manage a ton of devices with it. Ansible can use whatever number of what it calls forks. That's basically the number of simultaneous actions that you tell it to. So by default, it will use 5 forks or manage 5 devices at one time, but it can manage as many as you want. So that's entirely up to you. It depends on your network connectivity for your device, the amount of resources on the device. Usually RAM is the most important. You can also scale because Ansible has a built-in capability when it deploys Ansible Tower, which is our management tool, to deploy as many tower nodes as you want. Usually it's going to be groups of 3 or 5, but really you can deploy as many as you need. And Ansible will scale itself horizontally across all of those. So we can both scale up and scale out. So what is Ansible Tower? Since I just mentioned it, this screenshot right here shows what the admin interface of Ansible Tower is. But Ansible Tower is both our web-based management tool for Ansible, but it's also the central point for authentication, authorization, and auditing. That means that you can determine on this host who is allowed to do what, where, and when. You can define all those things in policies, and you can say you can define those across your entire infrastructure. You can also commit those. To your configuration management repository, so you can show management that this is defined and we never vary from that. One of the big and most powerful items about this is, especially in government networks, we all know that there's that prohibition against sharing passwords. And admittedly, especially on network devices, there's usually at least one or two exceptions in the network where there's just a device that all it supports is one single password or one password per access level or something like that, especially when dealing with legacy devices. This especially deals with things like lights out management devices. Those notorious for having very limited authentication and password capability. So one of the interesting things Ansible can do with a tool called Vault is you can actually give Vault that one password. So you set a password for a server, you give it to Vault, and that means you don't have to tell your administrators what that password is. That's a really big thing in a government network then, because by default, if someone who has admin access leaves your team, it means you have to change all the passwords. But if they never had the password to begin with, all you have to do is remove them from the group that's allowed to take a certain action. That's it. You don't have to change any passwords. You can also do a really neat trick where you have Ansible, you give it the initial password the device has out of the box or in its current configuration if you're in a brownfield environment. And then Ansible can change it to something only it knows and store it in Vault. Nobody knows the password, but it doesn't mean you're locked out, because you're still able to delegate the ability to manage the entire host at all levels without anyone knowing that password. That's a fairly big deal, and it's a fairly useful security tool. So Ansible Tower, it provides a bunch of capabilities. I already mentioned role-based access control. That's what I was talking about. We have the push button capability to implement automation. So what that means is once you defined your playbooks, you can give anyone the ability to run those playbooks. They don't actually have to completely understand what the playbooks are. It's still a good idea, of course, for everyone to understand the automation, as I mentioned before, that they're running. But that means you can give folks in your network operations center who are not engineers, who are just the ones who are looking at the lights on the board and responding and taking action, you can give them the ability to take action, whatever they need to do. We have a fully RESTful API, which means Ansible integrates into all your other existing management tools. If you have some network management or network auditing or stoplight chart or any sort of thing in your environment, you can actually integrate that with Ansible. You can also have your ticketing system integrate with Ansible. So if there's a ticket put in against a network device to say adjust a VLAN or something like that, when that ticket is then approved by the appropriate authority, then you can have Ansible automatically take an action. So no one else has to do anything other than to approve the ticket. That's a really neat thing you can do, especially for simple actions. We fully integrate with any sort of enterprise central authentication, TACACS, Radius, Azure, Active Directory, etc., anything you want. And of course, we can also do custom integrations if none of those fit your sort of your plan for your enterprise. You also can do notifications. We mentioned here PagerDuty, Slack, and Twilio, but of course we can do legacy email. We can take actions where Ansible reports somewhere and puts up on a website or creates a blog entry, anything you can think of based on an action. I mentioned the centralized logging before. Your automation is no good in a government environment unless you have the sort of auditing necessary to be able to say, you know, Alex took this action on this day, this time against these network devices. So it's absolutely critical and it's required for our government ATOs. And then we can create workflows. So we can say that our Ansible playbooks, if they run successfully, great, move on to the network. If they don't run successfully, we can move on to an alternate track and have a tree-based system where if that playbook fails, then you go change tack and you run another playbook to go try and either clean up the problem or discover what happens or whatever you need to do. So Ansible for network automation. So this is what we're here to talk about today. Just like every other part of Ansible, it is fully documented online. And one of the interesting things about Ansible is it has been so popular within the government that these pages, which are at docs.ansible.com, or you can again use this link down here, these pages are replicated on a lot of closed networks. For example, you can find these things in GovCloud. You know, it's all those things are there, and it shows the fact that Ansible is popular enough for people to put in the effort to get it approved and to put it there. But all the modules are documented here, but also Ansible is self-documenting. Ansible has an interactive command line interface where you can go and interactively execute tasks in Ansible, and it will help you with all the options for those tasks, give you all the arguments they have and all the possible returns. It also has a built-in documentation tool that you can use to look up the options for anything you want to do. So here in cloud, we can engage our users with an automation-focused experience. So you can engage with your users. You can see here, you can automate the collection and generation of knowledge. You can help users to collaborate. You can set up governance, and you can set up those rails that keep everyone on track and in the right area. You can make sure your content is trusted and all those deployed the same way. And you can accelerate the collection of data and management. So automation analytics. This is a software as a service solution on cloud.redhat.com, which is our central point of management for all things cloud. You can actually integrate that and collect Ansible automatic analytics for your organization there, give you the dashboard, health notifications, and organization statistics. This is completely optional. You do not have to do this. And of course, if you're a disconnected network, it doesn't make a lot of sense, but it does give you that central part of data collection. And it feeds into our management tool, Red Hat Insights, which is our predictive analysis service. What does it provide? It provides your central authentication. It gives you the dashboard that you can show to your upper management, to your leadership, and to your users. You can gain information about how automation is being used in your enterprise. You can see where automation is being used heavily and where it's not. You can see, if you've got a whole set of automation that used to work fine, but all of a sudden has been failing a bunch recently. It gives you that sort of overall data. This is very useful to CIOs and central management. And again, here's the dashboard. You can see the job status graph, top jobs, and top modules. So one of the things you can think of is when you think about modules, and I usually point this out earlier when I'm talking to a team that's more focused on development, but a module is equivalent to what we think of as a function in a programming language. So that whenever you see module, think function if you're a developer. Again, you can see your health notifications. If you look and see the tower server itself is broken, you can see the data hasn't been collected from the tower. You can see that a node within the tower is down. You can see how your licensing goes. One of the other interesting things about Ansible licensing, it comes in packs, and we don't do any sort of thing. If you gain 2 new hosts and you're licensed for 100 hosts and all of a sudden you have 102, we don't cut you off. That's not how Red Hat works. You contact us and you let us know, we work it out, no big deal, but that's all that happens. Here you can see your organizational statistics. You can filter by organization. You can see the job execution status. You can see the number of jobs run by a certain organization, and you can see the usage. And this shows you various teams that are going on. So, and here you can see your dashboard. You can see recent job templates. You can see no module data is passed along here, so it doesn't show any internals, and it can show you have clusters. You can see your automation analytics. You can see your top job templates, top modules, very similar to what we said before, and you can filter by cluster because you may have more than one Ansible cluster depending on physical location or team or organization or however. You can set up Ansible content collections. Those are collections of roles, which are what Ansible calls user-written collections of tasks, and they all work together. So for example, we may create a content collection that you use within your organization to manage your core switches. You may have another one for edge switches. You might have another one for GPS devices. You may have another one for routers, that sort of thing. It's all content you execute against them. So again, it basically brings that content together and allows you to distribute them much more easily. Additionally, we also have a tool we haven't mentioned here yet called Ansible Galaxy. That is our internet-hosted collection of all the roles that people have written. So whenever you're creating a new role for your organization, first thing I usually do is I go look at Ansible Galaxy and see if someone else has already done it. I may just use their role as it is, or I might take it and say, oh, that's a good idea. Let me look at what they did and let me use something that they used. So it really speeds me up. And again, you can deploy your own automation hub and you manage your collections there. You can use our automation hub, or you can create your own in your organization. As you see, you can publish locally on premise. So this is all of Ansible Automation Platform. You can see of all the things we can do here. Our components here are Ansible Tower that you've seen, and Ansible Engine. which is what actually executes the automation, and all the things you can do with them and all the use cases. Then you can see here cloud.redhat.com, which brings it all together. So Microsoft is a huge partner of ours. I myself have worked with Microsoft teams to implement Ansible, to talk about it, and they have adopted it wholesale. One of the big things Microsoft has been pushing for years is to get people away from the culture of interactively on the desktop, executing applications, installing MSIs, setting group policies, et cetera. They've been trying to get everyone to use the command line. They've been trying to use central management tools against everything, which is great. It's the best way to manage your enterprise, and Microsoft knows it, and they've used a ton of Ansible content to make this really easy. We can just about anything in Windows using an Ansible task. Obviously, we're talking about networking here, but as we know, Windows fits into networking. A lot of folks use Active Directory for their user database, for all the admins for their network, for example. So our next steps. Here's where we can go to get started. Just go to ansible.com. That's really the core to all of us. Everything that you need is on ansible.com. As I've mentioned previously, there's fantastic documentation. There's the community. You can sign up for a free trial. You can get all the information you need. If you go to ansible.com/workshops, you can see workshops that are going to happen soon. You can also go to redhatgov.io, which is our Red Hat public sector section for workbooks. As you can see, all kinds of Ansible getting started training that we've published. You can actually look at our Red Hat services automation adoption journey. You can follow the Twitter handle @Ansible, or you can friend us on Facebook. These are all great ways to get in touch, and we do hope you'll reach out and talk to us about what you're interested in doing, what you think about this, what you think about Ansible, and what kind of experience you have. So with that, what questions do we have? I don't see any immediate questions in the Q&A.
Thank you, Alex, very much for that excellent presentation and session. As you mentioned, we do have about 15 minutes left and can use this time for additional questions. Just to kind of kick things off, could you describe for us some of the features that Ansible Tower provides that aren't part of Ansible Engine?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, is that role-based authentication. So if you say you've got a bunch of folks who are admins of the network environment, you can give them full rights to set policy for your routers and switches. But if you have folks that are just operators, you want them to be able to deal with a network casualty, but you probably don't want them to make decisions that affect your entire network infrastructure. So those are two different roles you might set. It also does centralized logging. So any change that happens to any of your network devices gets logged at whatever destinations you want. It also provides the source of the API. So any automation that includes Ansible, say your ticketing system, say your network monitoring system, they all use that API through Ansible Tower to execute automation. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, and I hope it did for the listeners in attendance as well. And carrying off that vein, what are some of the other processes that are commonly automated with Ansible?
So one of the big ones in modern environments is the creation and management of containers. So we can create automation workflows to both containerize our tools and to push them out to all the sources we need to do to get them into your enterprise registries or even into internet registries if you're publishing online. So that's very powerful. For example, there's a ton of network monitoring tools. They have their own little dependencies, and to make them really easy to deploy, especially when they're small services, they use something like TNFS or TFTP, which a lot of our network devices still use to get their initial code or to do recovery in the event of a failure. It's very easy to take one of those services and put it in a container, so you make it very easy to deploy and manage. So that's something that's quite often done with Ansible. Additionally, you have code builds that are done with it. You have server automation and management, really anything you can think of. We've even had partners do interesting demonstrations at some of our big partner events, like at an event about 1.5 years ago now, we had a partner create automation to fly a drone using Ansible. So you can really do anything you can think of.
Fantastic. And then just one last one that we're seeing come through here, unless I'm missing one in the Q&A right now. When implementing an automation strategy, where should some of these agencies be starting?
Excellent question. I actually am going to grab a live question that just came in from, I think it's Moody C, who asks, is Ansible Red Hat proprietary? And the answer is no, it is not. Like everything Red Hat does, Ansible is open source. If you go to ansible.com, you can see exactly where it comes from. If you go to GitHub, you can download all the source code for Ansible Tower, for everything. Just go to github.com/Ansible and you got everything there. So you can see absolutely everything we do. So it's one of the most important things about Red Hat. So I'm really glad that you asked that question. So I'm sorry, Jack, you were asking again, where do you want to get started to create a central automation strategy?
Exactly.
So one of the biggest things to do is that remember that automation is about people. It's not about electronics. So the first thing you should do is start with is what we mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. Get your teams together, talk to them what their needs are, talk to them what their difficulties are, bring them all into one room and crowdsource that information. Find out what people need, find out what people are doing today, what automation they already may have, and then you can figure out where your solution is. And then you collaborate to create your plan and then you implement it.
That is great. Thank you so much, Alex. And we actually have another follow-up question here. So they're asking, there is no license needed for Ansible Tower?
We do have a subscription like all Red Hat solutions, and that provides you both support and instant security updates and access to Red Hat experts and all the other things you come to expect from Red Hat. But you can indeed use the open source version of Ansible Tower, which is called AWX, anytime you want. So other questions? And I do, please go ahead and throw them out there. If you have anything you can think of, please throw something out. I'm happy to answer.
Hey, Alex, can you hear me okay?
I can indeed, Jonathan.
All right, excellent. Hello, I'm Jonathan Van Meter. I was supposed to be presenting today, and I was, with many people, hit by the telecommunications outage today on the East Coast, so I was unable to present. And Alex, on literally last minute notice, jumped in and did a fantastic presentation. So Alex, thank you so much. That was really excellent. I did want to just mention one other use case real quickly. I would say that one use case that people use for network equipment, cloud platform servers and the like is really around security, because like Alex had talked about, Ansible looks at the configuration of devices before it actually takes any action. And if you think about trying to perform a security audit or validate the compliance of systems, it's really about looking at state and configuration of systems. And since Ansible, by its its core, is a stateful automation engine, it is very well, I guess, designed for the task of performing security activities around validating compliance or remediating when things are out of compliance. So I find that that's a very common theme that I am talking with my customers and partners around, is how Ansible can be used throughout the organization, not just configuring or deploying new resources and services, but also like how do they inventory what they have in their environment and also validate that the security of devices are configured appropriately.